Number two on your list of how the microbiome affects metabolism was blood glucose regulation, insulin resistance, and you kind of earlier spoke about lipotoxicity. So perhaps we can dive into this second way that the microbiome is influencing metabolism.
When I think about metabolism and measuring metabolism, I feel like there's a tremendous emphasis on the sugar. The CGMs have become very popular. But the issue is that can be like very easily manipulated and actually is not independently reflective of your metabolism. So now, don't get me wrong, a person who has diabetes will have a higher blood sugar when they eat the exact same thing as a person who does not have diabetes, right? But actually the better measure of what's going on with your body is insulin release.
Right, this is an important point. So you could have two people who have the exact same blood glucose response to the same meal, yet one of them is having to produce a lot more insulin to achieve that level of blood glucose.
And that would be insulin resistance. And insulin resistance has been associated with a number of different other metabolic disturbances, including not only high blood sugar, but high blood pressure, altered blood lipids, visceral fat, high inflammatory markers, high uric acid, increased blood clotting. Those are the physiologic issues that you get around insulin resistance. But also, we mentioned this earlier, but we're coming back to it again now that we're here. Insulin resistance is associated not just with type 2 diabetes, but also with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, with metabolic syndrome, with cardiovascular disease, and with polycystic ovary syndrome. So we don't want to have insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is present in all cases of type 2 diabetes. But you are not required to have type 2 diabetes in order to have insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is pre-diabetes as well. And I mentioned earlier that the statistics are that about 50% of Americans right now have either pre-diabetes or diabetes. So it's disturbing because the vast majority of Americans, they have this issue.
And so what's the connection between the bacteria, our microbiome, and insulin resistance?
So I want to pull up a study that and again, I'm going to talk through this, but if you're on YouTube, you can actually look at the visuals here. This was the study that really got me excited about Zoe and the work that's being done there. It's from the PREDICT-1 study. Now, the PREDICT-1 study was Zoe's entry into personalized nutrition. And what we did is we had 1,100 people. Actually, a huge percentage of them were twins, either identical or fraternal twins. But we had 1,100 people that we did a whole series of tests on, including feeding them the exact same food and then assessing their response to that food. So what I'm about to show is looking at a person's blood glucose after eating. Bear in mind, everyone is eating the exact same thing in the graph that I'm about to show. And so what you see with this graph is that individual blood glucose responses, Simon, are widely variable. Some people are super high, some people are super low. They're all over the place.
And that can be influenced not only by diet, but by sleep, by exercise, a bunch of things.
By a number of different things. But what's important to keep in mind is that, when we say things like, the average blood sugar response, right? Or glycemic index, or like, this is what's going to happen. Like, we make it sound like this is what we know what's going to happen with your body. This is actually showing us that no, our individualized response is very different than the average.
Exactly. None of us as an individual are the average. Well, we could be,
right? But
we also could fall below or above.
Right. Well, we're all going to be something different from the average. It's just a question of like, how far from the average are we, right? Like, it'd be quite unlikely for us to be like perfectly average in every single way, So it'd be interesting. But so the question is like, what actually predicts that blood sugar after a meal? Because again, all these people are eating the exact same food. So what are the predictive factors that, if you were trying to build a model of how to say what a person's blood sugar looks like, you would use these predictive factors and you would weigh them based upon this. And genetics is really important. And so is what you're eating. Like, what you're eating is like the most important factor in terms of predicting your blood sugar. Microbiome is rather high. Microbiome is one of the most powerful factors. It's more important than your age, your body habitus. So in other words, like your microbiome predicts your blood sugar more so than your waist circumference does. So that's all very interesting. But what I find more interesting is looking at insulin. Because once again, all of these people are eating the same thing. And so who were the people that needed a lot more insulin in order to basically process this food? That's a measure, that to me is the measure of metabolism. Insulin resistance is the measure of metabolism. And once again, what we see in this graph is that the insulin responses are all over the place. So different people are having a different response, even though everyone is eating literally the exact same food. So what are the predictors of that insulin response? The number one thing is your blood sugar. So, and that's not a surprise, right? Because that's like the way that your body is wired. When your blood sugar goes up, you release insulin, right? So it's to be expected that the person who has a high blood sugar response will also have a high insulin response. That's expected. But the number two factor out of literally everything is your microbiome.
Right, and this is tying together a lot of concepts that other guests on the show have spoken about. It makes a lot of sense. It comes back to the first point we were talking about, energy intake, and the way that short chain fatty acids affect these incretin hormones, which affects satiety. My understanding of insulin resistance is that largely it can be explained by sort of energy poisoning, consuming too many calories and not being capable of storing that fat subcutaneously, and it starts to spill over into these organs that you mentioned before, muscle, pancreas, and liver, and then that is a driving force in the development of insulin resistance.
Yes. So, and that driving force that you're referring to is called lipotoxicity. And if I were to explain it, basically it's an excess of free fatty acids that are in the bloodstream. And where do they come from? Well, they can come from the fact that your fat cells are not taking up free fatty acids. That could be part of it. They can come from the fact that your fat cells are so overburdened that they're actually spilling and pouring fat into the bloodstream. So this is part of the reason why obesity is associated with insulin resistance. Because in that case, the fat cells are actually spilling free fatty acids into the bloodstream. And then the third thing is they can come from your diet. And specifically, things like saturated fat drive up free fatty acids in the bloodstream after a meal, or trans fats. So, all right, well, these free fatty acids, what do? Well, the issue is that the free fatty acids, they have to go somewhere. And if they can't go into the fat cells, which is their natural home, then they're going to try to find a secondary home where they can take up residence. The places that they take up residence are the organs that we were discussing earlier, where inflammation takes place as a result of endotoxemia. The pancreas, the liver, and the muscle cells. Now, most people don't realize this, but when you eat a meal, your muscle cells are actually the most important organ in terms of regulating your blood sugar. I mean, aside from insulin, where does the glucose go? The answer is 80% of it goes into muscle cells.
It's like a sponge, or it should be.
Yes. So this is the place that basically can suck up that glucose. And this explains, by the way, Simon, why taking a walk after a meal and just activating your legs, not even a run, just taking a walk and activating your legs can help to bring your blood sugar down and regulate your blood glucose. So the problem is that when you have excess free fatty acids, they will actually enter into these muscle cells. And we call this intramyocellular fat. And it's been clearly demonstrated that this exists. And when you have a gummed up fatty acid deposition within these muscle cells, then the insulin is not able to actually do its job because the muscle cells are not accepting glucose because they're gummed up with fat. So basically the glucose is supposed to be going into the muscle tissue, but it can't. And so it stays in the bloodstream and it goes up, 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 up.
Which is forcing the pancreas to work harder.
Which is forcing the pancreas to work harder. So the pancreas doubles and triples down. Okay, more insulin, more insulin. If I give more insulin, eventually you're going to take this glucose. And the problem is like that's like literally, I'm describing insulin resistance right there.
Yeah. There's an analogy that I often share to help people understand glucose homeostasis. I might quickly share that. I think of a bathtub, but it speaks to the importance of muscle, and also I think this analogy may inspire people to walk and use their muscles, particularly post-meal. But if you think about a bathtub, so we have the tap at the top, that's where the water's flowing out of. We'll think of the tap as our liver. And then the bathtub is reflective of your circulation, and then the drain is your muscle. So if we either stop the tap from turning off or we block that drain, then we can have an issue. The bathtub can keep filling up and up, which represents blood glucose rising. And what you're speaking to, this sort of energy toxicity and gumming up of the muscle cells, is akin to putting that drain in, putting the blocking the drain. And as a result, the bathtub is filling up and blood glucose is rising to harmful levels.
That's right.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
If we think about this, like I mentioned earlier, people who have insulin resistance, they've lost their satiety mechanisms. They have an increased hunger drive, and they're prone to overconsumption of calories, right? Like in that study with the kids going to the buffet, the kids who had insulin resistance are the ones who are overeating. So when you do this, then you create an energy excess. When you create an energy excess, then your body goes into fat storage mode, and this promotes obesity. And when you create obesity and you're storing more fat, you are swelling up those fat cells, and you're creating an environment that ultimately leads to more free fatty acids in the bloodstream, which is lipotoxicity, which causes insulin resistance, which restarts this vicious cycle because now we have even more insulin resistance, which makes you seek out more food, excess calorie intake. Now, you can make this process even worse by adding more free fatty acids into the mix. You're pouring gasoline onto a fire. And the way that you do that is with saturated fat and trans fats. This is referring to the work of Cyrus Kambata and Robbie Barbaro from Mastering Diabetes. And this is the reason why for people to control their blood sugar, they both have type 1 diabetes. For people to control their blood sugar, they advocate for a low-fat, high-fiber diet. But it brings us back to then, so how do we break this cycle? How do we break that wheel? And the answer is fiber. And the reason why is because dietary fiber. So there are some things that dietary fiber does in terms of helping to balance out blood sugar after a meal. It just slows absorption, and that's more of like a barrier effect. The fiber is not getting digested, so it just is kind of a barrier to sugar absorption. But the other part is that our microbes will once again break down and process the fiber, release short chain fatty acids, and these short chain fatty acids will, okay, we talked about already, GLP-1. So short chain fatty acids release GLP-1, which goes to the beta cells in the pancreas and increase insulin release. But the short chain fatty acids also have ways to work their magic at the liver, at the muscle tissue, at the fat cells, at the pancreas, to help to reverse at every single one of those locations. So like stopping the release of fat into the bloodstream from the fat cells. That's one thing short chain fatty acids do. Increasing the absorption of glucose and activating those channels called the GLUT4 channel so that we can get sugar into the muscle cells. That's something that short chain fatty acids do. Stopping the uptake of fat into the liver, which by the way, this is, we alluded to this, I think twice already. We've now explained why fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease happens in the context of insulin resistance, because fat is getting deposited there.
And if I was to go back to that bathtub analogy, I left out that fat in the liver is akin to that basically damaging the tap so you can't turn it off.
Right.
And you just have glucose pouring out of the liver, and you're not able to dial that down.
Any person who has if you have fatty liver disease due to alcohol, it's a separate metabolic issue. But any person that has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, I don't need additional testing. I already know you have lipotoxicity and insulin resistance.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people to understand that if they have insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, like the work of Mastering Diabetes, who you just mentioned, but Roy Taylor's work, his clinical work, I know, has had a huge impact on Cyrus and Robbie and their program. And he's been able to show repeatedly, multiple clinical trials, the direct trial, counterbalance, counterpoint, a bunch of them, that you can actually put type 2 diabetes into what they call remission and essentially return to normal blood glucose levels, come off all medications. And it does depend on how long you've had type 2 diabetes and as a result, how sort of beat up your pancreas is.
Yeah.
But what they find is that for many people, particularly if they have had type 2 diabetes for less than 10 years, and very much so if they've had it for less than 5 years, if you lose 10 to 15% of body weight, you can often enter that stage of what they call remission.
Yeah. And this is part of the reason why fat loss, regardless of dietary choice, can be beneficial to diabetes in the sense that when you lose fat, you can reduce the fat intake content of your liver, reduce the fat content of the fat cells, and as a result have lower levels of free fatty acids. But it's actually shocking, Simon, how quickly a dietary modification can result in insulin resistance. So first of all, just to reiterate though, I wholeheartedly agree that diabetes, type 2 diabetes specifically, not type 1, type 2 diabetes is a wildly reversible condition. Not to claim that it's easy, but there are dietary strategies that can definitely fix this. So, but just to show you how quickly we can put ourselves into a state of insulin resistance, let's go back to the Kevin Hall study. And just to refresh everyone, we're going back to the study where the people went into the metabolic ward and they did 2 weeks of plant-based and 2 weeks of animal-based. All right, animal-based keto. And if my theory that I'm proposing to you, which is that saturated fat pours gasoline on the fire of lipotoxicity and insulin resistance, and that fiber has the magical healing capabilities of breaking the cycle and restoring insulin sensitivity, if that is true, then why don't we put that to the test in these populations who are doing in the plant-based diet, they're doing a high fiber, low saturated fat diet. And in the keto diet, they're doing a high saturated fat, low fiber diet. Okay, let's put it to the test and see what happens. And I'm going to, once again, for people who are on YouTube, I'm going to pull up some graphs here, but I'm going to describe what I'm seeing. So what we're looking at first are free fatty acid levels after a meal. So you can see that we're looking at time, 60 minutes, 120 minutes, 180 minutes after a meal. And the red line is the keto diet. The green line is the plant-based diet. And basically what we see in this graph, Simon, is that when people are consuming a plant-based diet, their free fatty acids are like ridiculously lower relative to the animal-based ketogenic diet. Okay. So my first part of my theory, which is the free fatty acid content, I'm on track so far, which is that the high fiber, low saturated fat diet has low free fatty acid levels, while the high saturated fat, low fiber diet has very high free fatty acid levels after a meal. But let's finalize this. One of the hallmark tests of insulin resistance is called an oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT. And the way that this works is that if you and I were both doing this, Simon, we would go in and they give us a sugar beverage, and we're both consuming 75 grams of simple sugar. And that way, if we're both consuming literally the exact same amount of sugar, we can see how high our blood sugar goes. And that will tell us whether or not we have insulin resistance, right? When we have a standardized meal and one of us is going to have a spike in sugar and the other one is not. Okay. So, and what we see in this is that, again, these are literally the exact same people, Simon. It's the exact same person. So this is not a genetic issue. Both, like every single person did both the plant-based diet and the high fat keto diet. And what we see is that the keto diet has blood sugars that peak about 30 points higher after consuming the exact same amount of carbohydrate, sugar, as the plant-based diet.
So they've induced a state of relative insulin resistance. I think some keto people might push back a little bit and say, yeah, but if you change their diet back to a high carb, high fiber diet in a week or so, they'd be back to normal.
Yeah, but that if you change it back to a high fiber diet, they will be normal, and that's showing you the flexibility of the body and the metabolism, right? But also it makes an argument: shouldn't we all be consuming high fiber? Why would you not?
Right. The other point that I want to quickly add is, and you've spoken directly to this, is the importance of the type of fat, because often Mastering Diabetes use a sort of low fat across the board diet, but my read on the data on liver fat and on insulin resistance is that polyunsaturated fats have a very different effect to saturated fat.
Yeah, and that's why I was quite specific to say that it's just saturated fat or trans fat that where the real concerns exist. Like I'm not concerned that that the use of olive oil is problematic. Now, I will say there are people that have what we would describe as, like medically, we would describe it as brittle diabetes. And I think this is part of the motivation from Robbie and Cyrus with Mastering Diabetes, is that they both have type 1. And there's a lot of sensitivity there. And so as a result of that sort of brittle diabetes where your blood sugar can like sort of go all over the place, too high, too low, and it's just all over the place, having that sort of balance in terms of your diet and consistency, I do think that there are benefits to that in the way that they describe it. So I understand where they're coming from.